Welcome back. So, on this Australia Day, let's try the best we can to take a closer look to get a picture of what happened on this day in 1788 and what that first year and those first few years were like in the colony. We complain about aspects of the pandemic not being handled well. Well, I've got to say, what Arthur Phillip had in front of him for 12 years did not work the way it was planned. Did Arthur Phillip go about engaging Indigenous communities as they built the settlement, or was it the invasion it's accused of being? Joining me now is an award-winning journalist and author of at least 7 biographical books on the early years of Australia, Grantlee Keyser. Grantlee, thank you very much for giving up some of your Australia Day. I want to get straight to Sir Joseph Banks. Joseph Banks, you wrote a book about this fellow. He was instrumental in ensuring that there was a First Fleet, wasn't he?
Oh, very much so. In the middle of the 1780s, the British government had a couple of committees to, very importantly, investigate what they could do about their overcrowded prison system and the ships on the Thames that were overflowing with prisoners, the prison hulks. They looked at a number of options. They couldn't no longer send convicts to America the way they were doing because America was involved in the War of Independence, so they couldn't send convicts to America anymore. They looked at some of the slave ports in Africa, but it was Banks who came up with the idea of colonising New South Wales and particularly Botany Bay because he and Captain Cook had been there in 1770, and Banks thought that the area was well enough far away from Britain that any escaped convicts wouldn't cause any social problems back in England.
And of course, that was the irony, Grantlee. That was the irony. They went to Botany Bay, the First Fleet, and realised it wasn't for them.
Well, that's right. When Arthur Phillip sailed into Botany Bay, he quickly realised that the area was too wide to accommodate safe shipping. It was too open to the elements. They couldn't get into the shore close enough to land. So, and the surrounding area, the area of Kurnell especially, was mostly sand dunes at the time. So Phillip decided to sail a few kilometres north along the coastline and quite miraculously and quite incredibly, he gazed then upon what he called the greatest harbour in the world. And he sailed in, looked at a number of coves. He found the one that had the best water supply, and he named that cove after Britain's Lord Sydney, and we now call it, of course, Sydney Cove. And the harbour was just the most magnificent thing. He saw it said it would take 1,000 ships. It was so magnificent. And so that was where the first colony in Australia began.
So the orders from London was to be conciliatory with the Aborigines and take them with you. How much of that went on in the first couple of years?
Well, the intentions might have started out nobly, but unfortunately British diplomacy almost always involved force and firearms. And even though Phillip, at the start, he was under orders to make friends of the Aboriginal people so that they would help the settlers, so that there wouldn't be any trouble with the new colony in New South Wales. But push led to shove. A number of convicts were speared out on work parties. A number of the early colonists fired into Aboriginal people. It's said that Henry Hacking, after whom Port Hacking in the south of Sydney is named, was actually the first European to kill an Aboriginal person, and he did that within the first year of settlement. And of course, relationships deteriorated. Phillip, even though he was very conciliatory towards the Aboriginal people, he was guilty of kidnapping some of them, including Bennelong, who he built a hut for on the Bennelong Point where the Sydney Opera House now stands. Even though he was quite conciliatory towards them, he also had a very militaristic streak, Arthur Phillip. He wasn't going to be pushed around by anybody. And when his convict gamekeeper was killed by the Aboriginal warrior Pemulwuy, Phillip ordered a massacre of 10 Aboriginal people, but he was talked out of that. But certainly the relationship had deteriorated very quickly between the white settlers and the Aboriginal people.
So in terms of the actual settlement, it was, in the early stages, quite a disaster. There was starvation. They couldn't farm very well. They didn't have proper farmers on the fleet to give them the expertise that they needed. And there was disease ravaging not only white but black colonies.
Well, very much. And of course, the conditions were totally different to what British people had experienced. The summer sun was... In January 1788 was literally cooking some of them, and food ran out very quickly. Their grain was covered with weevils. Phillip, the cattle that they brought from the Cape in South Africa ran away. So Phillip very quickly realised that they were going to be doing it very, very tough for food supplies for a long time, and he imposed very strict regulations. And in fact, it was only 4 weeks into Phillip's rule in New South Wales that the first execution took place. A guy called Thomas Barrett, who was a very skilled artist and made a beautiful engraving called the Charlotte Medal. It didn't do him much good because he was only here 4 weeks when Phillip had him hanged for stealing food. And before long, 6 Marines were also hanged for stealing food and government supplies. So it was a very dismal place for that first year in Sydney under Phillip's rule. And Phillip actually found it quite heartbreaking. It really damaged his health to quite an extreme way. And he ended up leaving after a couple of years.
There were a few women on board the First Fleet. They were well and truly outnumbered. Rum came into the picture and it became quite a debaucherous period.
Well, it did, and certainly there was a lot of sex going on. Watkin Tench, one of the Marine captains, he wrote that the sexes were kept apart on the ships, but certainly when they arrived, there was a lot of sex going on. Some of the debauchery has sort of reached mythological proportions, but there's no doubt that there were a number of pregnancies among those early ships coming to Australia, especially one called the Lady Juliana that came with the Second Fleet a couple of years after Phillip's arrival. A lot of the women, the voyage took 11 months to get here, but when it arrived, a lot of the women were heavily pregnant. So there'd been a lot of sex going on board that ship. It was actually, it's gone down in folklore as a floating brothel. And also there were many same-sex couples in early Sydney too. A lot of cohabitation between males long before, 200 years before same-sex marriage was legalised. There were a lot of convict men and settlers living as married couples.
We only sort of became prosperous, according to most historians, at the turn of the century, and that's more than 12 years after we arrived. So it was a damn awful project that took a while to get on its feet.
Oh, very much so. It was very much frontier territory for a long time, and I would say it would even be longer than 12 years. I don't think the colony of Sydney really took off. I mean, there were land holdings and farms, but I don't think the colony really took off until the reign of Governor Macquarie, the decade-long reign of Macquarie, which started in 1810, because he was the guy who really saw the potential for Australia as an agricultural powerhouse. He oversaw the crossing of the Blue Mountains, the road across the Blue Mountains, and he built some of Sydney's most beautiful buildings, which still stand today, and the beautiful parklands. He started the Botanic Gardens and oversaw the domain, the beauty of the domain. So he saw Sydney as a real jewel in the British crown. And I really think Australia took off towards nationhood with the reign of Macquarie.
Some wonderful descriptors there, some great analysis. I appreciate your time tonight. Enjoy the rest of your Australia Day.
My pleasure. Thank you very much, Chris.